Hello everyone. So for our last ed puzzle of the school year, we're going to be talking about the nervous system. Now, normally we spend about 2.5 to 3 weeks on the nervous system, and usually it's never enough time. So the idea that I'm going to try to do it in one lecture is pretty crazy. But I'm going to give it my best shot because I feel like your anatomy experience wouldn't be complete if I didn't mention probably the most important body system of them all. So I decided I'm still going to do it, and I'm just going to give you a very basic overview of the nervous system so that if you were ever taking any anatomy courses in the future, you would at least recognize some of the stuff that your teacher would teach you. If you could download this file from Notability and follow along with me, there'll be some links to some videos that I recommend you clicking on, and then of course you can add to the notes as we go as well. All right, first let's talk about what the nervous system does. So the function of the nervous system kind of has three parts. The first part is to gather sensory information, so from any of our sense organs, then to integrate that information into your nervous system, and then kind of decide what to do with it, and then act. So that would be the motor output. So get a signal, interpret the signal, and respond to the signal is kind of the threefold function of our nervous system. All right, the divisions of our nervous system are pretty complex. There's a lot of small divisions. So we're just going to go over the general divisions, and we won't talk too specifically about each one. So here we go. So the first two divisions of our nervous system are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So in the image, you'll see the central nervous system is in a pink color. So that includes your brain and your spinal cord. So your brain and your spinal cord, that's where the information is integrated. That's the command center. That's the system that is interpreting the incoming sensory information and issuing the outgoing instructions. So that's really the decision maker of the nervous system. Whereas the peripheral nervous system you see in kind of a light orange color, that's all your extraneous nerves that come out from your spinal cord and brain. So your cranial nerves, your spinal nerves, and then of course all your sensory organs. So of course there's further divisions beyond that. So your central nervous system is just your brain and your spinal cord, but your peripheral nervous system can be further divided into different subunits based on kind of the job. So first we have the sensory part of the peripheral nervous system, and just as that sounds, it takes in information from your sense organs. And then you have the motor division. So the motor division is the one that's communicating with our muscles. There is the voluntary part of the motor division, which is controlling our skeletal muscles. So that's telling our biceps and our quadriceps and every muscle that is a skeletal muscle, it's telling it to move, and we control that, so it's voluntary. But then there's also an autonomic portion of our motor peripheral nervous system, and that's involuntary. So those are the cardiac and smooth muscles and glands of our body. So those are all involuntary. So if our body receives a message, it's through our sensory portion of our peripheral nervous system. The message is sent to the central nervous system where it's interpreted, and then it goes back through the motor part of our peripheral nervous system where the message is delivered. If it's a voluntary action, it's called the somatic part of our peripheral nervous system, and if it's involuntary, that's the autonomic. From there, autonomic itself, the cardiac, smooth muscles and glands, it's even further divided into parasympathetic and sympathetic. And those are known as the rest and digest is the parasympathetic. So when we're calm and we're cool and we're relaxed, that's our parasympathetic nervous system working. And then our sympathetic nervous system is kicks into gear when we're stressed or excited and our heart's racing. That's the difference between those two. So in your notes in Notability, you will have a link to this video. This guy, I think I've showed you his videos before, is a phenomenal artist. And obviously this video is going to go into way more detail than I'm going to. But if you're ever planning on taking any other higher level anatomy class, I highly recommend you watch it because it's pretty cool. Okay, the next part we're going to talk about are neurons. We talked a little bit about these before, but neurons are the nerve cells, the main cell of the nervous system. So the major regions of a neuron is the cell body, which you see right here. That's what contains the nucleus and all the organelles. And then the other parts of the cell body are known as the processes. So these are the fibers that are extending out, and we're going to talk about those on the next slide. Okay, so the processes of a neuron include the dendrites. The dendrites are the part of the neuron that receives the message. So the dendrites receive the signal and send it to the cell body. Next, you have the axon. The axon is the long tail-like structure that you see right there that I highlighted in green. The axon takes the message from the cell body and sends it to the ends of the neuron. And these axons come in all different lengths. So you have super, super tiny ones like in your brain, and then the longest axon we've talked about is the sciatic nerve, which runs the whole length of your leg. And then you'll also see in this picture running along the axon are those kind of blue bubbles. That is the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath are these white, fatty materials covering and protecting your axon. And you can see that they're not actually touching each other, and that's because a nerve signal actually jumps between the myelin sheaths from one node to the other. And that's one reason why a signal travels so quickly through a neuron. Okay, and then as we get to the end of that neuron, you'll see those axon terminals, they're called. The axon terminals, we're zooming in on one right here, and hopefully this looks a little familiar because an axon terminal is where those little vesicles are that are holding the neurotransmitter. And we'll talk about this in a few slides, but once that action potential is received at the end of that axon, the neurotransmitters are released and it travels across the synapse, which is the space between two neurons, and that neurotransmitter travels to the next one and delivers the message. Okay, next we're going to talk about the different types of these neurons that exist in your body. Okay, so if you remember on the first slide, I kind of said that the function of the nervous system has kind of three parts to it. The first part is that we receive a signal from our senses. So those are sensory neurons that are receiving a signal. So for example, in this picture, you see the sensory neuron in blue. So maybe we'll just put an eye over here to kind of remind, wow, this is an amazing eye. Guys, I was almost an art teacher. Okay, that's supposed to be an eyeball. Anyway, so our sensory organs receive a signal and send a message down the sensory neuron. So the sensory neuron takes it to the central nervous system. So in this case, it's taking it to the spinal cord, but it could also be taking it to the brain. Okay, so now the next step is to process that signal. So that would be an interneuron. An interneuron is kind of like the middle guy. This is found only in the central nervous system, and it's receiving the signal from the sensory neurons and processing it. Next, and the last step, you have a motor neuron. And a motor neuron is going to take the impulse away from the central nervous system and send it to whatever muscle or gland that it might need to go to. So this is where the message is actually being delivered to its final destination. Okay, and probably one of your favorite parts of anatomy has to be the steps of a nerve impulse. So we're going to review those now. All right, so I'm going to take you through the steps just to refresh your memory of a nerve impulse. So remember, step one, the action potential arrives at the end of the neuron. So we're focusing right here at the end of the neuron, at the axon terminal, and it's not connecting, but it's very close to the next neuron, or if it's a motor neuron, it might be connecting to a muscle or a gland. But remember, they don't touch. There's that tiny space in between them known as the synapse. So the action potential arrives. Step two is those vesicles that are at the end of the axon terminal fuse to the end of the membrane of the axon terminal. Once those vesicles fuse, you see that the neurotransmitter is released into the synaptic cleft, into the synapse, the space between them. And then you see that the neurotransmitter is binding to the receptor of the receiving neuron or of the effector, the muscle, the gland, wherever the message is being received. So that's an overview of the neural impulse through an axon. So hopefully you remember that a little bit from our muscle unit because we talked about it the most there. All right, next I want to give you a quick overview of areas of the brain. So here's a side view of the brain. So we have the big top portion is known as the cerebral hemisphere. Sometimes you might hear it referred to as the cerebrum. So in this picture, it's this big, like, flesh-colored one. The diencephalon is, you see in purple, and then you have the cerebellum, which is in the back part of the brain. It's got kind of a different texture to it. And then you have the brain stem in this picture, which you see in green. Okay, next I'm going to take you through these regions of the brain, talk a little bit about the difference in function. Okay, first we're going to talk about the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is that big top part of your brain, and you've probably heard talking about like the left and the right side of your brain. And your cerebral hemispheres do have a left and a right side. The left side of your cerebrum controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your cerebrum controls the left. This is more than half of your brain mass, is that big cerebrum on the top, and it has a very characteristic kind of texture to it. It's full of gyri and sulci, and those are the ridges and the grooves. If you look at that picture, you kind of get a close-up version of that. You might also have heard of white and gray matter in a brain. So this image right here shows you the difference between the white and the gray matter. The white is the whitish colored part, and then the gray is the slightly darker color part. But the gray matter is the part that contains all the cell bodies, the dendrites, and the terminals of the neurons. So they're really like working parts of a neuron. And then the white matter is going to be all of the axons, the long tails. And if you remember, the axons are covered in that white fatty material called the myelin sheath. So that's why the white matter appears white. So that's really just the transportation part of the brain, is what that axon is. Now, of course, I had to show you a little bit about what we would have looked at in class. So this is a picture of a sheep brain. So you can see the cerebrum is the part we've been talking about, which is that whole big top part that you see right here. And it's divided into the left and the right hemispheres. You can see that there. Now, hopefully you remember a little bit about this from freshman bio, and this also relates to the skull bones we learned about in the skeletal system. But the different lobes of the brain are actually the same names as the bones that cover them. So we're going to just look at this picture, and then we'll talk about what these do. So first, the frontal lobe, which you see in, a red color. You can see this is in the front of your head, so right behind your forehead where your frontal bone is, and it has two smaller parts that you might not have learned in freshman bio called the premotor and the motor cortex. Next, you have your parietal lobe, which you see in blue, which also has a smaller specialized part called the primary sensory cortex. And then in the back of your head, you have your occipital lobe, and then your temporal lobe is the last part. If you remember when we learned about the temporal bone, the temporal lobe is kind of like if you were to follow the ear back, that's where your temporal lobe would be. So these are the four lobes of the cerebrum. Here's just a picture of a human brain, and you can see the difference. It's not as easy to see those lobes. There are some bigger fissures, which are like deeper grooves in the brain that kind of naturally separate those different lobes. I think you can really see the temporal lobe pretty well on this picture. All right, let's talk a little bit about function. The frontal lobe, which you see in orange, that is in charge of things like problem solving. It helps you produce speech, and it also helps you with your movement, basically deciding to move. So your frontal lobe is actually the last one to develop. And in you guys, it's still not even fully developed yet. So a lot of people say that younger people, that's why they have a little bit hard time making good decisions, is because that frontal lobe is not yet fully developed. Next, your parietal lobe, which you see in blue, that has a lot to do with sensory information. So orienting your body so you're able to walk in a straight line without falling over. Your sense of touch is in your parietal lobe. Your occipital lobe is your vision, so that's what's recognizing what's coming in from your eyes and interpreting it. And your temporal lobe, the last lobe of your cerebrum, is big with hearing and language, and also memory as well. Next, we're going to move on to the brainstem. So your brainstem is the part that connects to your spinal cord, and it has kind of three major areas: your midbrain, your pons, and your medulla oblongata. So the midbrain you see in the picture in green here, that's mostly just tracts of nerve fibers. It's connecting visual and auditory reflex centers. So it's really big on reflexes that are involving your eyes and your ears. Next, you see the pons. The pons is this kind of like bulging part that sticks out of the top of the brainstem. That is composed of a lot of fiber tracts. It also includes very specialized cells that help the control of our breathing. And then my favorite part of the brain, frankly just because I like the name, is the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brainstem. This is the part that connects directly to the spinal cord, and it controls many important centers that control heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, swallowing, vomiting. So the medulla oblongata is a very important part of the brainstem. All right, here's a picture of a sheep's brain. We're looking at the inferior side of it right now. So this would be the spinal cord, as it would be connecting to that. So there you see the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. All right, and the last part of the brain we'll discuss is the cerebellum. All right, the cerebellum, which you see in this picture in green, has a very interesting texture to it. So it's a lot different than the rest of the brain. And its main function is to control balance and equilibrium. It provides precise timing for your skeletal muscles to coordinate your body movements. The way I always remembered the cerebellum is I remembered that the two L's in the cerebellum look like a balance beam. So that's kind of how I always remembered it, if that helps you in future anatomy classes. All right, now just to get a view of the sheep's brain, here's the cerebellum back here. And then this is the sheep's brain that's been cut in half, so the left and the right hemisphere are separated. And here's the cerebellum. One thing I would have had you identify in our sheep brain dissection is that very interesting tree-like looking pattern inside the cerebellum, and that's known as the arbor vitae. And our arbor vitae simply translates as tree of life, and it's just because it looks, the way the gray and the white matter are arranged inside the cerebellum kind of looks like a tree. And here's just a closer view of that brain stem and that cerebellum. So you can see this is just the left hemisphere of the brain. So here's the cerebellum. You can really see that arbor vitae well in there. And then the spinal cord connecting to that medulla oblongata, and then that pons, which kind of bulges out. And then the midbrain would be right above there. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about how the brain is protected. So the brain has many layers protecting it. Obviously, the first one that probably comes to your mind is the scalp and the skin. That's the primary covering. And then under it, of course, is the skull for the brain, and then the vertebral column for your spinal cord. But under that, you have what's known as the meninges. And the meninges are three layers, which you can see right here, three layers of a very tough connective tissue. The outermost layer, which is called the dura mater, literally translates as tough mother because it's very, very tough. So it's there to protect you. And then you have cerebral spinal fluid to act as a shock absorber, and then the blood-brain barrier protecting your brain and your spinal cord from interacting with any viruses that might affect our body. If you've ever heard of meningitis before, meningitis is a rare infection that where the pathogen actually infects your meninges around your brain and your spinal cord. It causes the inflammation of those meninges. Okay, here's a picture a posterior view of the human brain. So on the left side, you can see the meninges have been removed, but on the right side, you can still see that dura mater, that tough mother that's on the outside. And then the layer of the skull and the scalp and then the hair. All right, and then the last part of the nervous system, I'll give you a brief overview, is the spinal cord. On the second day this week, our last activity, we'll listen to our chiropractic guest speaker, and she will talk about some of these things as well. So here is a picture of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord extends from your foramen magnum, which if you remember, that's at the very base of the skull. That's that big opening. And then it goes all the way down to your first or second lumbar vertebrae. It provides a conduction system, so messages can be received to and from the brain. It is made of 31 spinal nerves that arise from the cord. So you can see, if you zoom in on this picture, these little things coming out of the vertebrae. Those are all your spinal nerves. And it ends around lumbar vertebrae number 1 or 2. And then it kind of branches out. So it's after this point, it's not one big solid spinal cord anymore. It's a bunch of spinal nerves that are kind of arranged really close to each other. Okay, now we're going to look at some of those spinal nerves that come off. So remember, the brain and the spinal cord are that central nervous system, and now we're going to look at the peripheral part, those spinal nerves that come out from it. So first, let's talk about the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves are the ones that are coming, you can see right in this image right here, from the base of your brain, and it's traveling to different areas of the head and the neck. So there's 12 pairs of nerves. They're all serving the head and the neck. And there's only one pair of the vagus nerves that actually extends beyond that to your thoracic and abdominal cavities. And then here are your spinal nerves. So I really like this image because it shows you where the spinal nerves are going. And luckily the spinal nerves are named after the vertebrae, so it's pretty easy to understand where they're coming from. So for example, the C1 spinal nerve is coming from your C1 vertebrae. And in this table, which Dr. Warden, the chiropractic guest speaker, she'll talk a little bit about this picture. So when you're listening to her, you may want to pull this up just so you understand what she's talking about. But it talks about where that spinal nerve is heading to, so what areas and parts of the body. And then also if, since she's a chiropractor, she's concerned about if any vertebrae are out of alignment and any of these spinal nerves are affected, what some possible symptoms could be if the nerve is kind of being pinched by a vertebrae. All right, and then here is that same artist drawing the spinal and cranial nerves, so it gives you a very good overview. It'll go into way more detail than we just did, but if you're at all interested in the nervous system or planning on taking any anatomy classes in the future, I highly recommend watching it. All right, guys, well, that's it for the nervous system. I'm sorry that it was very fast and a really big overview of a very complex system, but I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about it. I always get a little emotional on the last lesson of the year because, it's kind of all over, so I just want to thank you guys for learning with me, especially at the end of this semester when it got a little strange, and it was definitely a different way to learn anatomy. I especially thank all those that stuck with me the whole time throughout the whole semester. I really appreciate you guys. You made it all worth all the work. And the second class of this week, we'll listen to our next guest speaker talk about some of this nervous system stuff. So thanks again, guys.